Imagine if something as simple as salt, a substance we use every day, could unlock deeper spiritual truths and powerful transformations in your life. The Bible speaks of salt not just as a seasoning but as a profound symbol of purity, loyalty, and even divine protection. Could it be that we've been overlooking the true power that salt holds, not just in our kitchen, but in our spiritual journey? While most people see salt as a mundane part of their meals, Scripture shows us a different perspective. Salt is a key to understanding God's eternal covenant and His promises of healing and preservation. Salt plays a significant role in the Bible, and its symbolism carries deep meaning across many passages. In ancient times, salt wasn't just an everyday seasoning, it was precious, often seen as a gift from God. This precious mineral held spiritual significance as well, representing purification, preservation, and covenant. Whether used in sacrifices, offerings, or everyday life, salt in the Bible goes beyond its physical properties and is tied to the divine. One of the key symbolic meanings of salt in the Bible is purification. Salt was considered a natural purifier, and its use in rituals represented spiritual cleansing. In ancient Israel, salt was often included in offerings to God to symbolize the purity of the gift. This act reflected the believer's desire for a purified heart, free of sin and impurities, much like salt purified food by removing bacteria and preserving it for the future. Another vital role of salt in the Scriptures is related to the idea of preservation. Just as salt preserved food from spoiling, it symbolized the preservation of one's faith and covenant with God. God's promises were often described as lasting forever, just like the preservative power of salt. For the people of the Bible, salt was a reminder that their relationship with God was to be steadfast, enduring through time and trials. In this way, salt came to represent the unbreakable bond between God and His people. The Bible also speaks of an alliance of salt, Numbers 18:19, where salt symbolizes an unshakable, eternal covenant. This alliance of salt was a powerful reminder that God's agreements with His people were permanent and irrevocable, just like salt's ability to preserve. Through the use of salt in this way, we see that it wasn't only important for survival but also for maintaining the spiritual connection between humanity and the divine. Additionally, Jesus called His followers, the salt of the earth, Matthew 5 verse 13. This powerful statement illustrates the importance of Christians to preserve the moral and spiritual fabric of the world. As believers, they are called to bring flavor and light to the world through their actions, representing the goodness and truth of God. Being the salt of the earth means maintaining spiritual purity and influencing those around you by living a life of faith. In conclusion, the meaning of salt in the Bible is rich and multifaceted. Whether through purification, preservation, or symbolizing an eternal alliance, salt serves as a spiritual tool that connects us to God's everlasting promises. From ancient rituals to Jesus' teachings, salt is a reminder of the divine power at work in everyday life, transforming the ordinary into something sacred. The role of salt as a preserver and purifier. Salt has been used for thousands of years not only for flavor but for its ability to preserve food and purify. In biblical times, these qualities were not only practical but deeply symbolic. The role of salt as a preserver and purifier carries profound spiritual meanings, making it a vital element in many religious rituals and teachings. In the Bible, salt represents the preservation of the faithful and the purification of the soul. As a preserver, salt was essential for ancient societies to keep food from spoiling, especially in hot climates. Without refrigeration, salt was the primary method to keep meat and other foods fresh. This practical use of salt is mirrored in the spiritual world. Just as salt preserves food from decay, it symbolizes the preservation of faith and righteousness. For believers, maintaining purity and staying true to God's teachings prevents the soul from spiritual decay. The Bible often uses salt to illustrate God's relationship with His people. In passages like Leviticus 2 verse 13, where offerings are instructed to be sprinkled with salt, it symbolizes the preservation of the covenant between God and His people. This act of adding salt ensured that the offering remained pure and acceptable to God. In this way, salt became a symbol of a lasting commitment, one that would not wither or spoil over time. Salt also plays a role in purification. Just as salt is used to clean and disinfect, it was often used in rituals to purify offerings and spaces. In the Bible, this purification is a reflection of the cleansing power of God's love and forgiveness. Salt purifies not just physically but spiritually. When salt is used in a religious context, it symbolizes the removal of sin and impurities, allowing believers to approach God with a clean heart. Beyond rituals, the purifying power of salt is connected to how believers are meant to live their lives. In Matthew 5 verse 13, Jesus calls his followers to be the salt of the earth. This is more than a metaphor, it is a call to action. As salt preserves and purifies, so too are Christians called to maintain purity in their hearts and preserve the world from moral decay. By living righteous lives, they serve as a spiritual preservative, keeping the world aligned with God's values. In summary, the role of salt as a preserver and purifier is vital both physically and spiritually. In the Bible, salt's ability to preserve food from spoiling and purify spaces reflects the need to preserve one's faith and cleanse the soul from sin. As Christians, we are called to embody these qualities, keeping our hearts pure and protecting the world from spiritual decay. The Salt Covenant in the Old Testament. One of the most intriguing uses of salt in the Bible is found in the concept of the Salt Covenant. This idea appears in several passages, such as Numbers 18:19, where God establishes an everlasting covenant of salt with Aaron and his descendants. The Salt Covenant symbolizes a binding, unbreakable promise, one that carries on through generations. In ancient cultures, salt was seen as a valuable commodity, and sharing it symbolized trust, loyalty, and permanence. The significance of salt in this context lies in its enduring nature. Unlike other substances that decay or dissolve, salt remains pure and does not spoil. This characteristic made it the perfect symbol for a lasting, unchangeable covenant. In the Old Testament, God's promises are often described as eternal, and the Salt Covenant emphasizes the unbreakable nature of his agreements with his people. Salt represented the perpetual and unchanging relationship between God and Israel. In biblical times, sharing a meal that included salt was often part of sealing a covenant. This act was more than just eating together, it was a sacred agreement that could not be broken. The Salt Covenant reflects this tradition, symbolizing the permanent, sacred nature of God's promise. Just as salt preserves, the covenant was meant to preserve the spiritual relationship between God and his people forever. The Salt Covenant also carries a sense of purification. As salt was used in sacrifices and offerings to purify, it symbolized the purity and holiness required in any covenant with God. This idea reflects the need for those who enter into a relationship with God to be cleansed from sin and remain faithful. The covenant was not just about loyalty but about maintaining a pure heart and soul in the presence of God. In today's context, the Salt Covenant serves as a reminder of God's unchanging love and commitment to his followers. Just as salt endures, so too do God's promises. Believers are called to remember this covenant in their daily lives, trusting in the everlasting nature of God's word and striving to live in purity and righteousness, preserving their spiritual connection with him. Practical uses of salt in ancient times and their spiritual significance. In ancient times, salt was a highly valued commodity, essential for survival. Its practical uses in food preservation and health are well documented, but its spiritual significance goes far beyond its physical properties. Salt, in the Bible, is more than just a seasoning or preservative, it symbolizes purity, faithfulness, and the eternal covenant between God and humanity. By exploring the practical uses of salt in ancient times, we can gain deeper insight into its spiritual symbolism. One of the most common practical uses of salt in biblical times was preserving food. Without refrigeration, salt was critical to keep food fresh, particularly meat. This practice of preserving food with salt became a symbol for preserving one's spiritual life. Just as salt kept food from spoiling, it was believed that living a righteous life, in accordance with God's commandments, preserved the soul from spiritual corruption. Salt was also used for purification in many different ways. It was used to clean wounds, disinfect, and purify water. These properties of salt carried over into its spiritual symbolism. Salt's ability to purify was a metaphor for spiritual cleansing. In the Bible, it was often used in rituals to symbolize the purification of offerings or to cleanse spaces of evil spirits. By using salt in these ways, people believed they were inviting God's purity into their lives and environments. Another practical use of salt was in trade. In ancient times, salt was a valuable resource, sometimes even used as currency. This value added to its spiritual significance. Just as salt was a valuable commodity in trade, it became a symbol of the precious nature of one's relationship with God. Maintaining a covenant with God was seen as the ultimate treasure, something to be valued and protected just as salt was in daily life. In conclusion, the practical uses of salt in ancient times were deeply intertwined with its spiritual symbolism. Whether it was used to preserve food, purify, or as a valuable trade item, salt represented eternal truths about faith, purity, and God's unbreakable promises. Even today, these symbols resonate with believers, reminding them of the importance of preserving their faith and living a life of spiritual purity. Jesus as the salt of the earth, Matthew 5 verse 13. In Matthew 5 verse 13, Jesus tells his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth." This statement is both powerful and symbolic. Salt, as we've seen, is essential for preservation and purification, and Jesus uses this imagery to emphasize the role his followers play in the world. Being the salt of the earth means more than just living a good life. It means actively preserving goodness, standing against moral decay, and bringing purity to a world in need of healing. In the ancient world, salt was incredibly valuable because it could preserve food and keep it from spoiling. In the same way, Christians are called to preserve the world from spiritual decay. This is a powerful metaphor, as it speaks to the believer's role in maintaining spiritual integrity and ensuring that society does not lose its moral foundation. Just as salt prevents food from rotting, followers of Christ are called to prevent sin and corruption from spreading in the world. But salt does more than just preserve, it also adds flavor. Jesus' teaching encourages believers to bring the flavor of God's love, compassion, and truth into every aspect of life. As the salt of the earth, Christians are meant to stand out, to make a difference, and to enhance the lives of those around them. This involves spreading kindness, upholding justice, and promoting peace, all while reflecting God's purity and goodness in everything they do. Jesus also warns that if salt loses its flavor, it is good for nothing. This serves as a reminder that believers must stay connected to their faith and purpose. When Christians fail to live according to God's teachings, they lose their ability to positively influence the world. The metaphor of salt losing its flavor highlights the importance of remaining spiritually strong and steadfast in the mission to bring light and truth to the world. Ultimately, being the salt of the earth is about living a life of purpose, service, and influence. It's a call to action for all believers to be agents of purification, preservation, and transformation in a world that desperately needs God's grace and truth. By embracing this role, Christians fulfill their calling and contribute to a world that reflects God's love and righteousness. The power of salt for driving away evil and attracting blessings. Throughout history, salt has been seen not only as a purifier but also as a protector. Many cultures, including those in biblical times, believed that salt had the power to drive away evil spirits and bring blessings into one's life. This belief is deeply rooted in the symbolic nature of salt, which represents purity and the divine presence. By using salt in certain rituals, people believed they were safeguarding themselves from harm and inviting God's protection. In the Bible, salt is often associated with cleansing and purification, and this extends to its role in spiritual protection. For example, in 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22, the prophet Elisha uses salt to purify a spring of water, making it clean and safe to drink. This act demonstrates the power of salt not only in the physical realm but also in the spiritual one. Salt's ability to purify water in this story is symbolic of its power to cleanse and protect individuals from spiritual harm. Salt has also been used in Christian traditions to bless homes and protect them from evil influences. By sprinkling salt around the home or placing it in specific areas, people believe they can create a barrier against negative forces and attract blessings into their lives. This practice reflects the ancient belief that salt, as a symbol of God's purity, could ward off evil and ensure divine protection. The use of salt in such rituals emphasizes its role as a medium between the physical and spiritual worlds. Just as salt purifies water or food, it is believed to cleanse the soul and keep evil at bay. This understanding of salt is not just limited to protection but extends to its ability to invite blessings into one's life. By using salt in rituals or prayers, people believed they were opening themselves up to God's grace, ensuring His favor and blessings would flow into their homes and lives. In conclusion, the power of salt for driving away evil and attracting blessings is deeply rooted in its symbolic nature. It represents purity, protection, and divine favor. By using salt in spiritual practices, believers can connect with God's power, ensuring both spiritual protection and the flow of blessings into their lives. How to bless your home and family using salt. One of the most ancient and powerful spiritual practices involving salt is the tradition of using it to bless your home and family. This practice, deeply rooted in biblical teachings, is based on the belief that salt can purify spaces, protect from evil influences, and invite God's blessings. By following simple rituals with salt, you can create a spiritually cleansed environment that brings peace, protection, and prosperity to your household. The first step in using salt to bless your home is to recognize its symbolic power. Salt, as we've seen, represents purity, protection, and preservation. To bless your home, you can sprinkle a small amount of salt in the corners of each room, asking God to cleanse the space of any negative energy or evil spirits. This practice is believed to create a barrier that keeps out harmful influences, allowing only peace and blessings to enter. Another way to bless your home with salt is by using it in prayer. You can hold a small bowl of salt while reciting a prayer, asking for God's protection over your family and home. Afterward, you can scatter the salt outside your home or at the entrance, symbolizing the presence of God's protection around your household. This act of faith is a powerful way to invite blessings and safeguard your family from harm. In addition to sprinkling salt, you can also use it in a cleansing bath for family members. By adding a handful of salt to a bath and praying over the water, you can spiritually cleanse yourself and your loved ones, removing negativity and asking for God's blessings to flow through your life. This practice is a physical and spiritual way to purify both body and soul, ensuring protection and grace for your family. Finally, another meaningful practice is to place a small bowl of salt in a prominent area of your home, such as near the front door or in the kitchen. This bowl can serve as a reminder of God's purifying and preserving power, acting as a symbol of protection and blessing for your family. Each time you see it, you are reminded of God's presence and the spiritual shield He provides for those who trust in Him. In conclusion, blessing your home and family using salt is a simple yet powerful way to invite God's protection and blessings. Through these rituals, you can create a space filled with purity, peace, and spiritual protection, ensuring that your home is a place where God's presence dwells. Rituals of purification with salt based on biblical texts. In the Bible, salt is frequently used in rituals of purification. These practices, which are still followed in various forms today, show the power of salt to cleanse not only the physical but also the spiritual realm. Salt's use in offerings and sacrifices, as instructed in the Old Testament, highlights its role in making things holy and acceptable to God. By incorporating these biblical purification rituals into daily life, believers can connect with the ancient practices that invited God's presence and favor. One well-known biblical example of salt being used in a purification ritual is found in Leviticus 2 verse 13, where God commands the Israelites to season all their grain offerings with salt. This act was symbolic of the purification and preservation of the offering, making it worthy of God's acceptance. The use of salt in this context shows its spiritual power to cleanse and make holy what is offered to the Lord. Another significant story involving the purifying power of salt is found in 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22. The prophet Elisha purifies a polluted spring of water by throwing salt into it. The water, once unsafe to drink, becomes fresh and clean, demonstrating the purifying power of salt in both the physical and spiritual sense. This story illustrates how salt can be used as an agent of healing and purification when called upon in faith. In modern times, these ancient purification rituals with salt can be adapted to everyday life. For example, sprinkling salt around your home while praying for God's presence can be a way to purify your living space, just as salt was used to cleanse offerings in biblical times. This practice invites God's protection and removes any negative spiritual energy that may have entered the home. You can also use salt in personal purification rituals, much like the sacrifices that were purified with salt in the Old Testament. Taking a salt bath while praying for spiritual cleansing is a modern-day version of these rituals, allowing believers to wash away not only physical impurities but also any spiritual burdens. By using salt in this way, believers can experience the same purification that ancient Israelites sought in their offerings to God. In conclusion, rituals of purification with salt, based on biblical texts, are a powerful way to connect with the spiritual traditions of the past. By incorporating these practices into your life, you can invite purity, protection, and the presence of God into your everyday experiences. The symbolism of salt in sacrificial offerings. Salt played an important role in sacrificial offerings throughout the Bible, symbolizing purity, preservation, and the permanence of the covenant between God and His people. In the Old Testament, salt was required in grain offerings, as seen in Leviticus 2 verse 13, "Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings, add salt to all your offerings." This directive points to the deep spiritual symbolism of salt in worship and sacrifice. The symbolism of salt in sacrifices begins with its ability to preserve. Just as salt keeps food from spoiling, it represents the enduring nature of God's covenant with humanity. When salt was added to an offering, it symbolized the eternal, unbreakable bond between God and His people. This covenant was to be upheld throughout generations, and the salt in offerings was a constant reminder of its permanence. Salt also symbolized purity in sacrificial offerings. In a time when sacrifices were a way to atone for sins and seek God's favor, adding salt was a way to ensure the offering was pure and acceptable to God. Salt was known for its cleansing properties, and its presence in sacrifices underscored the need for spiritual purity when approaching the Lord. The offering was made holy through the addition of salt, reflecting the desire for a cleansed, sin-free heart. Beyond purity and preservation, the use of salt in sacrifices signified the importance of sincerity and dedication in worship. Just as salt enhanced the flavor of food, it was believed that the salt in offerings enhanced the spiritual value of the sacrifice. It showed the worshippers' deep commitment to God, offering not just something physical but something spiritually meaningful. The act of adding salt demonstrated the desire for a lasting relationship with God. In today's context, the symbolism of salt in sacrificial offerings can still be a powerful reminder for believers. While physical sacrifices are no longer required, the spiritual principles remain. Salt symbolizes our desire for a pure heart, our commitment to God's eternal covenant, and the value of sincere, wholehearted worship. By remembering the role of salt in biblical offerings, we can reflect on the purity and dedication required in our spiritual lives. Salt as a symbol of eternal faithfulness. Salt's enduring nature makes it a perfect symbol of eternal faithfulness in the Bible. Unlike other substances that spoil or break down over time, salt remains pure and unchanged. This quality of salt is used throughout Scripture to symbolize the eternal and unchanging nature of God's love, His covenant, and the faithfulness required from His people. Just as salt preserves and lasts forever, so too must the faith of believers be steadfast and enduring. One of the most powerful representations of salt as a symbol of eternal faithfulness can be found in the concept of the salt covenant. In passages like Numbers 18:19 and 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5, we see that salt was a crucial part of the agreements made between God and his people. These salt covenants were described as unbreakable, eternal promises that reflected the unwavering nature of God's commitment. In these instances, salt represented not only God's faithfulness but also the faithfulness he expected from his people. In addition to covenants, salt also symbolized faithfulness in daily life. Jesus' call for his followers to be the salt of the earth, Matthew 5 verse 13, speaks to the need for Christians to remain faithful in their mission to preserve goodness and righteousness in the world. Just as salt preserves food from decay, believers are called to preserve their faith, keeping it alive and strong in a world prone to spiritual decay. Their faith, like salt, should be enduring and unchanging. Salt's enduring properties also remind us of the faithfulness of God. Throughout Scripture, God's promises are described as everlasting, and his love for his people is portrayed as unfailing. Salt is the perfect symbol of this divine faithfulness because it represents something that remains constant, pure, and reliable. Just as salt never loses its essence, God's love and promises never waver. In conclusion, salt as a symbol of eternal faithfulness is a powerful metaphor in the Bible. It reminds believers of the importance of remaining steadfast in their faith, reflecting God's unwavering commitment to them. As Christians, we are called to embody the same faithfulness, preserving our relationship with God and living out his eternal promises in our daily lives. Salt and the covenant of friendship in ancient cultures. In ancient cultures, particularly in the Middle East, salt was not only a valuable substance for preserving food and enhancing flavor, but it also played a significant role in social and spiritual relationships. Salt was often used as a symbol of friendship, trust, and loyalty. Sharing salt during a meal was seen as a sacred act, establishing a bond of trust that could not easily be broken. This practice became known as the Covenant of Salt, signifying an unbreakable agreement of friendship and mutual respect. The idea behind the covenant of friendship through salt is rooted in the properties of salt itself. Because salt preserves and lasts, it became a symbol of permanence and endurance. When people shared a meal that included salt, it wasn't just about the food, it was a sign of an enduring friendship or alliance. In ancient times, when two parties shared salt, it meant they were bound by a mutual agreement of protection and support. This covenant was considered sacred, and breaking it was viewed as a serious violation of trust. In the Bible, salt is used to represent these strong, lasting agreements. For example, in Numbers 18:19, God makes a covenant of salt with the Levites, ensuring his eternal provision for them. This covenant symbolizes a relationship that cannot be undone, much like the lasting nature of salt. Similarly, in 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5, God gives the kingdom of Israel to David and his descendants forever, through a covenant of salt. These passages show how salt represented an unbreakable bond, not just between individuals, but also between God and his people. The covenant of salt wasn't limited to divine relationships. In ancient times, salt was also used to seal agreements between tribes or nations. Sharing salt during negotiations or peace treaties symbolized a lasting commitment to the terms of the agreement. Because salt was so highly valued, sharing it was seen as a gesture of goodwill and faith. Once salt had been exchanged, it was understood that the parties involved would remain loyal to each other, bound by the covenant they had entered into. Salt also played a role in ancient hospitality customs. In the Middle East, it was common practice to offer guests salt with their meals, symbolizing that the host and guest were entering into a bond of friendship and protection. By sharing salt, the host promised to safeguard the guest, and the guest, in turn, promised to respect the host's home. This act created an unspoken agreement that neither party could betray the other, reflecting the deep cultural and spiritual significance of salt in building relationships. In conclusion, the covenant of friendship through salt was a powerful symbol in ancient cultures, representing loyalty, trust, and enduring relationships. Whether used in sacred agreements with God or in social bonds between individuals and nations, salt carried the weight of permanence and purity. It served as a reminder that true friendships and commitments should be as lasting and unchanging as salt itself, enriching relationships with trust and mutual respect. The healing properties of salt in biblical times. Salt has long been recognized for its healing and medicinal properties, even in biblical times. In addition to its role in food preservation and religious symbolism, salt was used as a remedy for physical ailments. The Bible reflects this understanding, portraying salt as a purifier not only for the soul but also for the body. Its ability to cleanse, purify, and heal was integral to its spiritual significance and practical use. One of the most notable stories involving the healing power of salt is found in 2 Kings 2 verses 19-22, where the prophet Elisha heals a spring of water that had become unfit for drinking. The people of Jericho came to Elisha seeking help, explaining that while the land was good, the water was bad and causing harm to the inhabitants. In response, Elisha throws salt into the spring, purifying the water and making it safe to drink. This miracle demonstrated salt's powerful role in cleansing and restoring not just physical health but also the land. Salt was also commonly used in ancient remedies to treat wounds and infections. Its antibacterial properties made it valuable for preventing infection and speeding up the healing process. In fact, salt was often applied directly to wounds or used in baths to soothe skin conditions. This practical application of salt as a healer parallels its spiritual use in purifying the soul, as both forms of healing, physical and spiritual, were closely intertwined in biblical thought. The belief in the healing properties of salt extended beyond physical health. Salt was often used in religious rituals to cleanse and purify spaces or individuals, removing not just physical impurities but spiritual ones as well. In many cultures, salt was sprinkled in homes, temples, and even on individuals to drive away evil spirits and promote spiritual healing. This practice reflected the deep belief that salt could act as a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms, bringing healing and protection on multiple levels. In modern times, salt continues to be recognized for its therapeutic properties. Salt baths, for instance, are popular for their ability to relax muscles, reduce inflammation, and detoxify the body. This ancient practice has endured through the centuries, proving that salt's healing power, both physical and spiritual, is timeless. Its ability to cleanse, heal, and protect remains a central part of health and wellness practices today. In conclusion, the healing properties of salt were as important in biblical times as they are today. Whether used to purify water, treat wounds, or cleanse the soul, salt's ability to heal is a testament to its enduring significance. From the miracle of Elisha's purified spring to modern-day salt baths, salt has always been a symbol of both physical and spiritual restoration. The role of salt in ancient worship practices. In biblical times, salt was a vital part of worship and religious rituals. Its presence in offerings and sacrifices was a powerful symbol of purity, covenant, and divine favor. From the grain offerings of the Old Testament to its inclusion in sacred ceremonies, salt held a sacred place in the worship practices of the Israelites. The role of salt in worship was not just practical but deeply symbolic, connecting the physical act of offering to the spiritual significance of God's eternal covenant. One of the clearest examples of salt's role in ancient worship is found in Leviticus 2 verse 13, where God commands the Israelites to season all their grain offerings with salt. This command was a reminder of the salt of the covenant, symbolizing the enduring and unbreakable nature of God's promises. By including salt in offerings, the Israelites demonstrated their understanding of the eternal bond between themselves and God, ensuring that their sacrifices were made with purity and devotion. Salt was also used in burnt offerings and other sacrificial rituals as a symbol of spiritual purity. Its inclusion in these offerings signified the cleansing of sin and the desire to present something pure and holy before God. In a time when sacrifices were essential to worship, salt's ability to preserve and purify made it the perfect addition to these rituals, reflecting the worshipper's hope for divine acceptance and favor. The preserving quality of salt also symbolized the enduring nature of the Israelites' relationship with God. Just as salt preserved food from decay, it represented the lasting nature of God's covenant and the people's commitment to remain faithful. Salt's presence in worship was a constant reminder that their relationship with God was meant to last forever, uncorrupted by time or sin. In many ways, the use of salt in worship practices went beyond mere tradition. It embodied the spiritual principles of faithfulness, purity, and eternal commitment. By offering sacrifices seasoned with salt, the Israelites expressed their desire for an enduring connection with God, one that was untainted by sin and worthy of His eternal favor. Salt, therefore, was more than just a substance, it was a powerful symbol of the relationship between God and His people. Today, while the physical act of offering sacrifices may no longer be practiced, the spiritual significance of salt in worship remains. It serves as a reminder of the eternal covenant between God and believers, calling Christians to live lives of purity, devotion, and unwavering faith. The protective power of salt in biblical rituals. Salt was not only a symbol of purity and faithfulness but also believed to hold protective powers in biblical times. This belief was deeply ingrained in both religious and cultural practices. Salt was seen as a substance capable of warding off evil spirits, protecting individuals, homes, and even entire communities from spiritual harm. This understanding of salt's protective power is evident in various biblical and ancient practices where salt played a role in spiritual defense. In the Bible, we see examples of salt being used in ways that suggest its protective nature. For instance, in 2 Kings 2 verses 19-22, Elisha's use of salt to purify the polluted water of Jericho wasn't just a physical act, it also had spiritual implications. The salt symbolized God's power to cleanse and protect the people from the harmful effects of the polluted water. This act demonstrated that salt, when used in faith, could provide both physical healing and spiritual protection. Beyond biblical stories, salt was commonly used in protective rituals in ancient cultures. People would sprinkle salt around their homes or at the entrances to ward off evil spirits and protect their families from harm. Salt was seen as a barrier that evil could not cross, making it a key element in rituals designed to ensure safety and spiritual protection. This belief was so widespread that salt became synonymous with spiritual defense, often used in conjunction with prayers and blessings to enhance its protective power. Salt's protective properties were also connected to its purifying nature. Just as salt purified food and water, it was believed to purify spaces and individuals from negative spiritual influences. In many religious ceremonies, salt was used to cleanse altars, sacred objects, and even the bodies of worshippers before engaging in worship. This purification was seen as essential for maintaining spiritual health and ensuring God's protection. In modern spiritual practices, salt continues to be used as a symbol of protection. Many people still use salt in cleansing rituals, whether by sprinkling it in their homes or using it in salt baths to remove negative energy. These practices, rooted in ancient traditions, reflect the enduring belief in salt's ability to protect both physically and spiritually. In conclusion, the protective power of salt in biblical rituals highlights its significance not only as a physical substance but also as a spiritual one. Through its use in purification and protection rituals, salt became a symbol of God's safeguarding presence, defending His people from harm and evil. Its role in spiritual defense continues to influence religious practices today, reminding believers of the power of God's protection. Salt as a symbol of hospitality and peace. Salt has long been associated with hospitality and peace, especially in biblical times and ancient cultures. When guests were invited into a home, sharing a meal seasoned with salt was a powerful act that symbolized more than just nourishment, it was an offering of protection, trust, and friendship. In these cultures, the act of eating salt together signified an unspoken agreement of mutual respect and peace, creating a bond between host and guest that was nearly sacred. The tradition of offering salt as a sign of hospitality is seen in both the Bible and historical records of ancient cultures. In the Middle East, to share salt with someone was to promise safety and protection while they were under your roof. This was no small gesture, it was an invitation to enter into a temporary covenant of peace. Breaking this covenant by harming or betraying a guest after sharing salt was seen as a grave dishonor, not just in a social sense but in a spiritual one as well. In biblical times, hospitality was considered a key virtue. We see examples of this in the story of Lot, who welcomed strangers into his home and offered them safety, Genesis 19, and in Abraham, who showed hospitality to 3 angelic visitors, unknowingly welcoming divine messengers, Genesis 18. While salt is not explicitly mentioned in these stories, the tradition of offering food and protection speaks to the broader cultural practice of salt as a symbol of peace and hospitality. Salt's role in establishing peace is also reflected in its use during peace treaties between tribes or nations. In ancient times, it was common for warring parties to seal a peace agreement by sharing salt. This symbolic act was believed to bind the agreement, ensuring that peace would be maintained. The presence of salt in these treaties showed that the agreement was meant to endure, just as salt preserves and lasts over time. Today, salt remains a powerful metaphor for hospitality and peace. It serves as a reminder of the bonds that are formed through shared experiences and mutual respect. While the cultural practices may have evolved, the idea that salt represents peace and friendship continues to influence how we think about welcoming others into our homes and lives. Whether through breaking bread or offering a warm meal, the essence of salt's symbolic power remains strong. Salt in the teachings of Jesus, being the salt of the earth. One of the most well-known biblical references to salt comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth," Matthew 5 verse 13. This statement carries deep spiritual meaning and has been interpreted in various ways, but at its core, Jesus was calling his followers to preserve and enhance the goodness in the world, just as salt preserves and enhances food. Being the salt of the earth is a call to live out a life of faith, making a positive impact in the world. In the ancient world, salt was a valuable commodity because of its ability to preserve food, preventing decay and keeping it fresh. Jesus used this metaphor to explain the role of his disciples in society. They were to act as a preserving force, keeping the world from moral and spiritual decay by living out the principles of God's kingdom. This call to be the salt of the earth is a challenge to maintain integrity, righteousness, and goodness in a world that often strays from these values. Salt also enhances the flavor of food, making it more enjoyable and satisfying. In the same way, Jesus was telling his followers to enhance the world around them. By living out their faith, showing love, and spreading the message of the gospel, they were to make the world a better place. Their presence should add flavor to life, bringing hope, peace, and joy to others. Just as food without salt can be bland and unsatisfying, a life without the influence of God's people would lack spiritual vitality and goodness. However, Jesus also warns that if salt loses its saltiness, it is no longer useful. This statement emphasizes the importance of staying true to one's faith and calling. For Christians, being the salt of the earth means continually growing in faith and living out God's principles in their daily lives. If they become indifferent or complacent, they lose their effectiveness in spreading God's kingdom on earth. Just as unsalty salt is discarded, a faith that lacks action and influence has little value. In today's context, Jesus' call to be the salt of the earth remains as relevant as ever. Believers are challenged to preserve goodness, enhance the lives of those around them, and maintain their spiritual vitality in a world that desperately needs it. The metaphor of salt encourages Christians to live with purpose, bringing God's love and truth to every corner of society, and making the world a better place through their actions and influence. As you reflect on the incredible significance of salt throughout biblical history, ask yourself, how could something so simple hold such profound power in your spiritual journey? Are you ready to embrace the purity, preservation, and protection that salt symbolizes in God's covenant? It's not just about adding flavor to your meals, it's about adding depth and meaning to your life. The question is, are you willing to see the unseen power in what the Bible reveals about salt and apply it to your everyday faith? What would change in your life if you started to view your spiritual walk with the same enduring purity that salt represents? How might your relationships, your health, or even your inner peace improve if you began living with the awareness of this ancient wisdom? Don't let these insights remain just knowledge, start applying them today. If you're ready for a deeper connection to the divine, now is the time to act. If you found this eye-opening and want to keep learning, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future teachings that will continue to transform your spiritual and everyday life. Together, we'll uncover more hidden truths that the Bible has in store, and take actionable steps to live out our faith with purpose and clarity.